Cold sweat dampens the back of your neck when the notification pings. You meant to email your landlord, a desperate, angry demand to fix the deadbolt before you freeze or get robbed in this miserable apartment. Instead, a careless typo sends it into the digital void. You expected an automated bounce back. What you get is a single, chilling line that stops the blood in your veins. I am coming. 10 minutes later, heavy boots shatter the quiet of the hallway. Exhaustion tasted like old copper and unbrushed teeth. Maeve rubbed the heels of her hands against her eyes until sparks bloomed in her vision. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in the shoebox apartment, casting harsh, bluish shadows over the stack of unpaid bills and the half-eaten bowl of cold oatmeal sitting on the Formica counter. The digital clock in the corner of her screen read 11:42 p.m. Her heater had been broken for 6 days. November in Chicago was bleeding through the single-pane windows, settling into the cheap laminate flooring and radiating up through her wool socks. She could see her breath. She pulled her fraying cardigan tighter around her shoulders and brought her hands back to the keyboard. The plastic keys were worn smooth, oily under her fingertips. She needed to write this email. If she didn't send it tonight, she would lose her nerve by morning. And Mr. Carmichael would ignore her for another week, leaving her to freeze. She typed the address into the to line, j.carmichael@westendmanagement.com. Or so she thought. Her fingers were stiff, numb at the joints. She missed the Owen Carmichael, her pinky slipping over the X instead. j.zarmichael@westendmanagement.com. She didn't notice. Her eyes were focused on the body of the text. She had spent the last 20 minutes drafting and redrafting, deleting apologies, trying to scrape together a tone that was firm but not evictable. She settled on raw desperation, laced with a threat she couldn't afford to back up. I am not asking anymore. It's below freezing in here. The deadbolt is still sticking, and someone tried the handle again last night. If you aren't here tonight to fix this, I am withholding rent and calling the city inspectors. Do not ignore me. Fix this. Maeve read it twice. Her stomach churned. She hated conflict. She was the kind of person who apologized when someone stepped on her foot on the subway. But the fear of someone rattling her door handle at 2 a.m. had finally eclipsed her social anxiety. She took a breath that hitched in her chest. She slammed the enter key before she could delete the draft. Whoosh! The email vanished from her outbox. Maeve slumped back in the hard wooden chair, the tension draining out of her, leaving behind a shaky, hollow feeling. She stared at the screen, waiting for the inevitable anxiety to spike. Would he evict her? Could he evict her in winter? She pushed the laptop away and stood up. Her joints popped in the quiet room. The refrigerator hummed its rattling, dying tune. She needed tea, something hot to thaw her chest. She walked over to the narrow kitchenette, turning the tap. The pipes groaned, spitting out icy water into her chipped ceramic mug. She set the mug in the microwave, punched in 2 minutes, and hit start. The machine roared to life, vibrating the entire counter. Ping. Maeve froze. She turned her head slowly toward the kitchen table. The laptop screen had lit up with a new notification. 11:44 p.m. 2 minutes. Carmichael never replied to anything in 2 minutes, let alone at midnight. She abandoned the microwave, walking back to the table with hesitant steps. She dragged her finger across the trackpad to wake the screen. A new email sat at the top of her inbox. From j.zarmichael@westendmanagement.com. Subject, R.E. Maeve frowned, squinting at the address. Zarmichael? Her stomach dropped as she realized the typo. A cold flush of embarrassment washed over her. She had sent an aggressive, unhinged threat to a stranger. It was probably a dead domain, or worse, some corporate inbox. She clicked the email to read the inevitable automated rejection. There was no block of corporate text. There was no message undeliverable banner. There was only a single line of text, formatted in stark, default black font against the glaring white screen. "I'm coming." Maeve blinked. She stared at the words until they blurred. "I'm coming." It wasn't a joke. It didn't read like a joke. It read like a promise. She checked the recipient address again. westernmanagement.com. It looked like a normal property company. But why would someone reply to a misdirected email from a stranger with 3 words that sounded like a threat? A nervous laugh scraped its way out of her throat. "It's a bot," she muttered to the empty room. "It's an auto-reply. Some weird out-of-office message." But auto-replies had signatures. They had contact information. This had nothing, just a blank, white expanse of screen beneath those 2 words. Beep, beep, beep. The microwave finished its cycle, the sound startling her so badly she jumped, knocking her knee against the table leg. Pain flared, sharp and grounding. She rubbed her kneecap, her breath coming a little faster now. "Stop it," she told herself, her voice sounding entirely too loud in the cramped space. "You're overtired. You're paranoid." She closed the laptop. She didn't want to look at the screen anymore. She walked to the microwave, pulled out the hot mug, and dropped a cheap chamomile tea bag into the water. She watched the yellow color bleed into the clear liquid. 10 minutes. That's all she needed to calm down. Drink the tea. Put on another sweater. Go to sleep. The first 3 minutes passed in absolute silence, save for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the cooling microwave. Maeve sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug. The ceramic was burning her palms, but she welcomed the pain. It gave her something to focus on besides the heavy, irrational dread sitting in the pit of her stomach. "I'm coming." Who writes that? If a stranger gets an angry email about a broken heater and a deadbolt, they either ignore it or they reply, "Wrong address, crazy lady." They don't agree to show up, unless they know where she lives. She set the mug down on the bedside table with a dull thud. Her mind began to spin, cataloguing the terrifying possibilities of the digital age. Did her email signature have her address? No, just her name. Did the IP address give away her location? She didn't know enough about computers to be sure. Minute 4. A car drove past her building. The sound of its tires hissing against the wet asphalt made her tense. She waited for it to slow down. It didn't. It faded into the distance. She let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish. Minute 6. The wind picked up, rattling the loose window pane in its frame. Maeve stood up and walked to the window. She lived on the 2nd floor, overlooking a narrow, badly lit alley that separated her building from a defunct dry cleaner. The yellow glow of the street lamp barely pierced the gloom. Rain had started to fall, a fine, freezing mist that slicked the pavement. Everything looked normal. Empty garbage cans, a stray cat darting under a parked, rusted sedan. She turned away from the window, rubbing her arms. She was being ridiculous. The email was a fluke, a glitch in some corporate server. Minute 8. A low, deep rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Maeve froze in the center of the room. It wasn't the rattling hum of a cheap sedan. It was the heavy, guttural purr of an expensive engine. She crept back to the window, pressing her shoulder against the peeling paint of the wall, and peered through the edge of the blinds. A black SUV had pulled into the alley. Its headlights were off, but the running lights cast an angry crimson glow against the brick of the opposing building. It sat there, idling. Rain beaded on its tinted windows. It looked like a shark resting in shallow water, sleek, massive, and entirely out of place in this run-down neighborhood. Maeve swallowed hard. Her throat was sandpaper. Just a drug deal, she whispered to herself. It happened sometimes in the alley. It had nothing to do with her. The engine cut out. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. Maeve watched as the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out into the freezing rain. She couldn't see his face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark overcoat that fell to his knees. He didn't rush or hunch his shoulders against the wet cold. He moved with a terrifying, unhurried grace. He closed the door behind him without a sound. He looked up, directly at her window. Maeve jerked back, flattening herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Had he seen her? The blinds were drawn, but the street lamp might have caught her shadow. She listened. The heavy, solid sound of the front door downstairs opening. It didn't squeal on its hinges like it usually did. He caught it. He controlled it. Minute 10. Footsteps on the stairs. They were slow, deliberate. The wood groaned under his weight, a deep, structural protest. Thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. He was walking up to the second floor. There were only 2 apartments on the second floor. Hers and Mrs. Higgins across the hall, who was currently in a nursing home in Boca Raton. Maeve looked around her apartment in a rising panic. Weapon. She needed a weapon. Her eyes darted over the mess. The laptop? Too awkward. A butter knife? Pathetic. She grabbed the heavy, thick-bottomed ceramic mug of hot tea from her nightstand. It was heavy enough to crack a skull, and the boiling water inside was a deterrent. It was a terrible plan, but it was all she had. She backed into the tiny hallway, positioning herself out of direct line of sight from the door. The footsteps stopped outside her apartment. Maeve stopped breathing. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, suffocating. She gripped the mug so hard her knuckles turned white, the heat searing her skin. A shadow blocked the sliver of light under her door. She waited for him to try the handle. She had told him the deadbolt was broken. If this was the man from the email, he knew he could just push his way in. But he didn't try the handle. He knocked. 3 sharp, measured raps of a knuckle against the cheap wood. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a frantic knock. It was the knock of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had all the time in the world. "Who is it?" Maeve's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again, aiming for loud and angry. "I called the cops. They're on their way." A beat of silence. Then a voice filtered through the wood. It was deep, rough, and entirely calm. "Open the door, sweetheart, before I take it off the hinges. It's drafty out here." The sheer audacity of the demand snapped something in Maeve's brain. It bypassed her terror and hit a raw nerve of pure, exhausted anger. She had been cold for a week. She was tired, broke, and now some lunatic was threatening her door hinges because of a typo. "Go to hell," she yelled, her voice vibrating in the small space. "I'm already there," the voice replied. "Now open the door. You said you wanted the deadbolt fixed." Maeve blinked. The deadbolt. He was here because of the email. She crept closer to the door, her bare toes curling against the freezing laminate. She pressed her eye to the scratched brass peephole. The hallway light was flickering, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the man standing outside. The fisheye lens distorted him, but the core details remained sharply intact. He wasn't a sleazy landlord, and he certainly wasn't a handyman. He was dripping wet. Rain clung to the shoulders of a heavy, tailored charcoal coat. Underneath, a dark suit strained against a broad chest. His face was shadowed, angular, with a jawline that looked like it had been cut from granite and a nose that had definitely been broken at least once. He stood perfectly still, his hands buried in his pockets. He didn't look angry. He looked annoyed and bored, which was somehow vastly more terrifying. "I can hear you breathing against the door," he said quietly. Maeve jerked her face away from the peephole. "I don't know who you are," she said, her chest heaving. "But I made a mistake. I sent an email to the wrong person. Please leave." "You emailed West End Management?" "Yes, by mistake. I meant to email my landlord." A long sigh filtered through the wood. "Open the door. I just want to look at you. Make sure you aren't a cop. Then we'll talk." "No. I told you I'd take it off the hinges. I wasn't making conversation." The handle rattled. Maeve flinched, raising the mug of scalding tea. The man didn't kick the door. He didn't throw his shoulder into it like in the movies. He simply pressed his weight against the wood near the lock. The cheap, rusted deadbolt gave a high, metallic whine, snapping under the pressure. The door swung open with a pathetic squeak. Maeve threw the tea. She didn't hesitate. She hurled the scalding liquid straight at his face. The man moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't duck. He simply shifted his weight, turning his shoulder. The boiling water splashed harmlessly against the thick wool of his coat. The heavy ceramic mug hit his bicep and shattered on the floor, sending jagged white shards across the threshold. He looked down at the broken ceramic, then slowly looked up at her. Maeve scrambled backward, hitting the kitchenette counter. She grabbed blindly behind her, her hand closing around the handle of a rusty skillet. The man stepped into the apartment. The air in the room changed instantly. He brought the outside with him. The smell of wet asphalt, cold rain, expensive vetiver cologne, and underneath it all the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Or maybe blood? He seemed to take up all the oxygen in the tiny room. He looked around. His eyes, a dark, fathomless brown, swept over the peeling wallpaper, the dying refrigerator, the laptop on the table, and finally settled on Maeve. He took in her oversized frayed sweater, her messy hair, her pale face, and the skillet she was wielding like a broadsword. The heavy, terrifying mask of the intruder cracked. A flicker of genuine, profound confusion crossed his face. "You're just a kid," he muttered, his voice losing its threatening edge, replaced by a rough disbelief. "I'm 26, Maeve snapped, her hands shaking so hard the skillet wobbled. "Get out!" He ignored her, closing the splintered door behind him. He reached into his coat. "Don't!" Maeve shrieked, raising the pan higher. He froze, his hand inside his lapel. He pulled it out slowly, holding a sleek black smartphone between his index and middle finger. "I'm checking the email," he said, his tone carrying the forced patience one uses with a feral cat. He tapped the screen, his eyes flicking between her and the phone. J.Zarmichael@westendmanagement.com. You sent this? "I meant J. Carmichael, with a C." The man stared at her. He looked at the email again. He dragged a large hand down his face, wiping away the rain. When he looked back at her, the annoyance had deepened into a grim exhaustion. "West End Management is a shell corporation," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a very slow child. "It doesn't manage properties. It manages liquidations. The address you typed is an encrypted channel for my fixers." Maeve stared at him. The words weren't making sense. Fixers? Like plumbers? A harsh, short laugh barked out of him. "Sure, plumbers. We clean up messes." He pocketed the phone. "The message said you were freezing, the deadbolt was busted, and someone was trying the handle. You threatened to go to the city inspectors. In my world, city inspectors means the feds. I thought one of my safe houses had been compromised. The skillet in Maeve's hand suddenly felt very heavy. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her dizzy. You're a criminal. I'm an opportunist. You're an idiot who doesn't check her spelling. I was tired, she argued defensively, the absurdity of the situation making her lose her filter. My heater is broken. The man looked at the pathetic space heater in the corner, unplugged and useless. He looked at her blue lips. Put the pan down, he said. No. He stepped forward. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut and swung the skillet. He caught her wrist mid-air. His grip was a vice, warm, calloused, and unyielding. He didn't twist or hurt her. He just stopped her momentum completely. He took the skillet from her trembling fingers with his free hand and dropped it on the counter. He let go of her wrist and stepped back, giving her space. My name is Arthur, he said, and right now, we have a problem. We? Maeve clutched her wrist against her chest. I don't have a problem. You broke into my apartment. You can leave now. I won't tell anyone. Arthur shook his head, water droplets flying from his dark hair. You sent a distress signal to a secured server, a signal that pinged my location to an active receiver. I drove here thinking I had a rat backed into a corner, but I wasn't the only one monitoring that frequency. Maeve felt the blood leave her face. What are you talking about? Arthur walked past her toward the window. He didn't touch the blinds. He just stood near the wall, listening. I've been tracked, he said softly. The moment you hit send, you lit up a beacon. My rivals have been trying to isolate that server for 6 months. You gave them an exact geographical coordinate. But I'm nobody. This is a mistake. Doesn't matter. Arthur turned to look at her. The boredom was gone from his eyes. They were sharp now, calculating. Deadly. They followed my signal here, which means right now there are men outside who think you're my informant. No, Maeve whispered, backing away until her spine hit the refrigerator. No, you have to tell them. Tell them it was a typo. They aren't going to knock and ask for clarification, sweetheart. Before Maeve could process the sheer, suffocating weight of his words, the quiet of the apartment was violently ruptured. The glass of her bedroom window shattered inward. A heavy metallic cylinder, no larger than a soda can, bounced across the cheap, laminate flooring, hissing violently as it rolled toward the kitchenette. Thick, acrid grey smoke began to violently pour from its seams, filling the cramped apartment with the smell of burning sulfur. Get down, Arthur roared. He lunged across the room. He didn't grab her arm. He tackled her, his massive frame driving her into the narrow gap between the counter and the refrigerator. Maeve hit the floor hard, the breath exploding from her lungs. Arthur's heavy wool coat blanketed her, smelling intensely of rain and gun oil, pressing her face against the cold linoleum. The smoke alarm on the ceiling began to shriek, a piercing, frantic wail that drowned out the sound of heavy boots suddenly hitting the fire escape outside her window. The mistake was no longer digital. It was standing on her balcony. Acrid smoke clawed down Maeve's throat, tasting like burnt rubber and battery acid. She choked, a raw, wet sound that was instantly swallowed by the deafening shriek of the fire alarm. Her eyes watered so violently she was effectively blind. The linoleum pressed against her cheek, vibrating with the heavy thud of boots landing on the metal grating of her fire escape. Arthur's weight was a crushing, solid reality over her. He didn't smell like expensive cologne anymore. He smelled of sweat, damp wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. "Hands over your ears," he shouted. His voice was a harsh rasp, barely audible over the alarm. "Keep your mouth open so your eardrums don't blow." Maeve couldn't process the instruction. Her brain was completely short-circuiting, caught in a loop of pure animal panic. She squeezed her eyes shut, curling her knees to her chest. Arthur cursed, a short, vicious syllable. He shoved off her, his large hands gripping her wrists and forcing them over her ears. "Stay flat!" He rolled away just as the remains of the window frame gave way. Wood splintered and glass crunched heavily beneath thick-soled boots. Someone had entered the apartment. Maeve peered through the stinging grey haze. The smoke was thickest near the ceiling, leaving a narrow, murky band of visibility near the floor. She saw 2 pairs of legs clad in dark tactical pants. They were moving toward the bed, kicking the lumpy mattress aside. Arthur was a shadow, moving within shadows. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't yell. He lunged from the cover of the kitchen island, a heavy, silent mass of kinetic violence. He took the first man at the knees. The impact was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The man screamed, a high, reedy sound of absolute agony, and went down hard. His rifle clattered against the radiator. The second man pivoted, bringing a handgun up. Gunfire in a movie is a sharp, clean pop. Gunfire in a 150-square-foot apartment is a concussive blast that rattles the teeth in your skull and sucks the air from your lungs. Bang! Bang! Maeve screamed, pressing her face against the floor, her ears ringing with a high, sustained whine that drowned out the alarm. Flashes of muzzle fire briefly illuminated the peeling wallpaper in strobes of sickly yellow. Arthur didn't go down. He had closed the distance, driving his shoulder into the second man's chest and slamming him backward into the dying refrigerator. The appliance groaned, tipping dangerously. The door popped open, spilling a half-empty carton of milk and a glass jar of pickles onto the floor. The jar shattered, sending a sharp wave of vinegar into the sulphurous air. It was a messy, brutal struggle. There was no choreographed martial arts. It was 2 heavy men fighting for leverage in a space meant for one. Fists connected with meat and bone. Grunts of exertion and pain filled the brief silences between the blaring alarm. Arthur pinned the man's gun arm against the freezer door. With his free hand, he grabbed the heavy, cast-iron skillet Maeve had abandoned on the counter. He brought it down with a sickening, wet thud. The man slumped, sliding down the front of the fridge, leaving a thick, dark smear of blood against the white enamel. Silence descended, heavy and ringing, save for the rhythmic shriek of the smoke detector. Arthur dropped the skillet. It clanged against the floorboards. He leaned heavily against the counter, his chest heaving, his breath whistling through his teeth. He reached up, pressing a hand to his left shoulder. Dark blood was rapidly soaking through the grey wool of his coat. He didn't look heroic. He looked tired, older, and deeply irritated. He turned his head, his dark eyes slicing through the thinning smoke to find Maeve. She was still wedged between the counter and the floor, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. She stared at the man bleeding out by the refrigerator, the vinegar and blood mixing on the cracked linoleum. "Hey!" Arthur barked, his voice rough. Maeve flinched, her wide, terrified eyes snapping to his face. "Can you walk?" he demanded. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. She nodded weakly. "Good. Because your neighbors are definitely calling the cops, and more of these guys are probably coming up the front stairs." He stepped over the groaning man on the floor, ignoring the broken glass crunching under his boots, and reached down. He hauled her up by the back of her frayed cardigan. Her legs felt like wet sand. She stumbled, her bare feet slipping on the slick floor. "My shoes," she gasped, the words tearing at her raw throat. "I need my shoes." "You need to breathe," Arthur countered, dragging her toward the broken window. "We're taking the fire escape." "No!" Maeve planted her feet, a sudden, desperate stubbornness flaring through the panic. I'm not going out there. I don't know you. You brought them here." Arthur stopped. He turned back to her, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the cheap rug. The annoyance in his face hardened into something cold and absolute. "I did," he agreed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet register. "I brought them here, which means they know what you look like now. If I leave you here, the cops will ask you questions you can't answer, and my competitors will finish what they started to make sure you never talk. You are out of options, typist." He didn't wait for her to process the brutal truth. He grabbed her arm, his grip slick with his own blood, and shoved her through the shattered window frame into the freezing, relentless rain. November rain felt like needles against Maeve's skin. She hit the rusted iron grating of the fire escape barefoot. The cold was an instant, shocking agony that sliced through the adrenaline haze. She slipped, her knee slamming hard against the metal, tearing the fabric of her sweatpants and scraping the skin raw. "Move," Arthur ordered from behind her. He squeezed through the window, moving stiffly, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Maeve didn't argue this time. The terror of the dead men in her kitchen propelled her forward. She scrambled down the slick, rusted stairs, her bare feet going numb against the freezing iron. They descended into the pitch-black alleyway, the only light coming from the pulsing red taillights of the idling SUV. "Get in the passenger side," Arthur rasped, tossing her a heavy set of keys. She caught them clumsily, dropping them twice before her shaking fingers could find the unlock button. The heavy armored door of the SUV swung open with a pneumatic hiss. Maeve scrambled inside, collapsing into the wide leather seat. Arthur threw himself into the driver's side. He slammed the door shut, cutting off the sound of the rain and the distant sirens. The interior of the car was a sensory shock. It was dead silent, insulated against the chaotic world outside. It smelled intensely of new leather, expensive detailing wax, and now the sharp, heavy stench of fresh blood. Arthur didn't bother with a seatbelt. He slammed his hand against the push-to-start button. The engine roared to life, a deep, vibrating growl that shook the floorboards. He threw it into drive and floored the accelerator. The heavy vehicle surged forward, fishtailing wildly on the wet asphalt before the heavy tires found traction. They blasted out of the alley, blowing past a rusted dumpster and tearing into the empty, rain-slicked street just as the first wail of a police siren echoed from 2 blocks away. Maeve clutched the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. She stared out the windshield, the wipers thrashing frantically against the downpour. The city blurred past in streaks of neon and streetlight. "You're bleeding?" she said. Her voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from someone else. "Grazed," Arthur grunted, keeping his right hand locked on the steering wheel. His breathing was heavy, uneven. He reached over with his good hand and cranked the heat. A blast of dry, scorching air hit Maeve's face. It felt painfully hot against her freezing skin, making her shiver violently. She looked down at herself. Her frayed cardigan was soaked, clinging to her collarbones. Her bare feet were smeared with black soot, rusted iron flakes, and a few bright red smears of blood that weren't hers. "My laptop," she whispered, the absurdity of the thought hitting her like a physical blow. "My laptop is on the table, and my phone." "They're gone." Arthur took a sharp corner, the heavy car leaning aggressively. "Forget about them." "I can't just forget about them." Maeve's voice cracked, a hysterical edge creeping in. "My rent money is under the mattress. My entire life is in that apartment. Your life was over the second you hit send on that email." Arthur's tone was entirely devoid of sympathy. It was a flat, clinical statement of fact. He glanced at her, taking his eyes off the road for a fraction of a second. He saw her violently trembling shoulders, her pale, terrified face, the way she was shrinking into the corner of the heavy leather seat as if trying to disappear. He cursed under his breath, a long, tired string of profanities. He hit a button on the console. "Open the glove box," he ordered. Maeve didn't move. She was staring at her soot-stained feet. Maeve. He used her name for the first time. He must have seen it in the email signature. It sounded strange in his rough, gravelly voice. "Open the damn glove box. There's a med kit." She snapped out of her stupor, her hands shaking as she popped the latch. A black canvas bag tumbled out onto her knees. "Open it," Arthur instructed, keeping his eyes on the road. "Pull out the gauze and the pressure bandage." Maeve unzipped the bag. Her fingers fumbled with the sterile packaging. She managed to tear open a thick square of white gauze. "Lift my lapel," he said. She froze, looking at him. He was a massive man, an absolute stranger, a criminal who had just beaten a man to death in her kitchen. The thought of touching him made her stomach heave. "If I pass out from blood loss at 60 miles an hour, we both go through the windshield," Arthur stated bluntly. "Lift the coat." Swallowing the bile in her throat, Maeve leaned awkwardly across the wide center console. Her trembling fingers grasped the heavy, wet wool of his coat. She pulled it back. The white dress shirt beneath was ruined, saturated with a dark, spreading stain near his collarbone. The bullet hadn't hit dead center, but it had torn a jagged, ugly groove through the meat of his shoulder. Blood was pulsing from it in a slow, rhythmic rhythm. "Press the gauze directly into the tear," he ordered, his jaw clenching. "Hard, don't be gentle." Maeve squeezed her eyes shut and pressed the thick pad against the wound. Arthur let out a sharp, hissing breath through his teeth, his grip on the steering wheel whitening his knuckles. The heavy SUV swerved slightly before he wrestled it back into the lane. "Keep the pressure," he ground out. Maeve held on, her arm aching with the effort. Her palm was instantly warm and wet. The metallic smell of copper filled the small, heated space, suffocating and intimate. She opened her eyes, watching the blood soak through the pristine white gauze, staining her own pale fingers. She looked at his profile, the harsh lines of his jaw, the deep shadows under his eyes. He didn't look like a man in control anymore. He looked like a man surviving on pure, stubborn friction. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small, lost in the hum of the powerful engine. "Somewhere they won't look," Arthur replied, his eyes locked on the dark, wet road ahead. "Somewhere underground." He glanced down at her bloodied hands holding him together, then back to the street. "You wanted your deadbolt fixed, sweetheart. Congratulations. You just traded it for a vault." Concrete swallowed them whole. The SUV plunged down a steep, unlit ramp, leaving the chaotic hum of the city and the relentless driving rain behind. Overhead, heavy steel grated shut with a mechanized, final-sounding clank that vibrated in Maeve's molars. Fluorescent tubes flickered to life, one by one, casting a sickly, pale green wash over an expansive, entirely empty subterranean parking garage. Tires squeaked in protest against the painted epoxy floor as Arthur whipped the heavy vehicle into a space near a featureless grey door. He threw the transmission into park. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence in the cabin was so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against Maeve's eardrums. "Let go," Arthur rasped. Maeve blinked, her brain sluggish, thick with the aftermath of pure terror. She looked down. Her right hand was still clamped hard over the gauze on his shoulder. Her fingers were stiff, locked in a claw-like grip. The blood had begun to cool and congeal, gluing her skin to the thick wool of his coat. She peeled her hand away. The wet, tearing sound of the fabric separating from her palm made a fresh wave of nausea roll through her stomach. Arthur didn't wait for her to recover. He shoved his door open, his boots hitting the concrete with a heavy thud. He swayed, just a fraction of an inch, his broad frame leaning against the armored door frame for a microsecond before he forced his spine straight. He moved with a stiff, deliberate mechanical energy, walking around the hood of the car to her side. He yanked the passenger door open. The subterranean air smelled of stale exhaust fumes, damp concrete, and old dust. "Out!" he ordered. Maeve swung her legs out. Her bare feet hit the freezing floor. She tried to stand, but her knees unhinged entirely, turning to water beneath her. She pitched forward, bracing for the hard impact of the concrete. It never came. Arthur caught her by the bicep with his good hand. His grip was bruising, hauling her upright with an irritated grunt. He didn't offer a comforting word. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply shoved her forward, keeping a tight hold on her arm to ensure she didn't collapse again, and marched her toward the featureless grey door. He punched a 6-digit code into a rusted keypad on the wall. The metal door disengaged with a heavy, magnetic thunk. They stepped into a freight elevator. The walls were scratched, dull steel, illuminated by a single caged bulb that cast harsh, unforgiving shadows over Arthur's face. He hit a button, and the car lurched upward, the cables groaning a deep, industrial protest. Maeve stared at her reflection in the polished metal of the doors. She barely recognized herself. Her pale skin was smeared with black soot. Her hair was a tangled, damp mess sticking to her cheeks. She was wearing a cheap, fraying cardigan over an oversized t-shirt, and her hands were painted in a violent, sticky crimson. She looked like a victim from a late-night news broadcast. She shifted her gaze to Arthur's reflection. He was leaning against the back wall of the elevator, his chin tucked down, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a corpse that had simply refused to lie down. "You need a hospital," Maeve heard herself say. Her voice was raspy, stripped raw from the smoke and the screaming. Arthur's eyes flicked up in the reflection, meeting hers. They were flat, deadened by pain. "I walk into an ER with a gunshot wound. The police are notified before I even hit the triage desk. That doesn't work for me. You're going to bleed to death. I've survived worse than a graze from a panicked amateur." The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing an entirely different world. There was no hallway. The elevator opened directly into an expansive, open-plan penthouse. The transition from the gritty, industrial garage was jarring. The floors were polished, dark walnut. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the far wall, their heavy, mechanized blackout shades drawn tightly shut, locking out the city skyline. The furniture was minimalist, sharp edges and dark leather. The air was sterile, heavily filtered, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive, unscented cleaning supplies. It was a fortress, designed to look like an architectural magazine spread. Arthur stepped past her, leaving wet, dark drops on the pristine wood floor. He bypassed the sprawling living area and headed straight down a short hallway, kicking open a heavy oak door. "Bathroom," he barked over his shoulder, gesturing to a door across the hall. "Wash your hands. Strip the top layer of your clothes. They smell like sulfur and gun smoke." Maeve stood in the center of the massive, empty room, wrapping her arms around her shivering torso. The sheer scale of the place, the terrifying quiet, it all began to press down on her. "Where are we?" "Nowhere," Arthur called out from the other room, his voice strained. "And you don't exist here. Go wash the blood off." Scalding water turned the porcelain sink into a slaughterhouse. Maeve scrubbed a thick, coarse bar of unscented soap furiously between her palms, watching the pink, diluted blood swirl down the stainless steel drain. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, red, and burning. She scrubbed long after the water ran clear. She stared into the mirror above the sink. The adrenaline that had propelled her out the window and down the fire escape had finally evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. A violent, uncontrollable tremor started in her hands and quickly took over her entire body. Her life was gone. It hit her not as a grand, cinematic realization, but as a series of mundane, pathetic losses. Her favorite coffee mug shattered on her floor. The $50 in emergency cash tucked under her lumpy mattress. The overdue library book on her nightstand that was currently soaking up the rain blowing through her broken window. She would lose her temp job entering data for the logistics firm on Monday. She would miss her rent. She bent over the toilet and dry heaved. Nothing came up but a thin, bitter string of bile. She sat on the cold tile floor for a long time, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to force her lungs to take in air. She was trapped in a bunker with a murderer, a man who had snapped a human being's leg backwards like a dry twig. But he took you with him. A treacherous, small voice whispered in her head. He didn't leave you for the police, or the men with the rifles. Maeve pulled off her soot-stained cardigan and her oversized t-shirt, leaving her in just a cotton tank top and her sweatpants. She splashed cold water on her face, dragged a shaking hand through her tangled hair, and pushed the bathroom door open. She found Arthur in what looked like a master bedroom, stripped of all personality. A massive, unmade bed sat in the center. Arthur was sitting on the edge of it. He had stripped off his ruined coat and the bloody dress shirt. His torso was a map of violent history. Faded white lines of old knife scars slashed across his ribs, and a puckered, star-shaped burn sat just above his hip. But the current problem was his left shoulder. The bullet had taken a deep, ugly gouge out of the top of his deltoid. A heavy black trauma kit sat open on the mattress beside him. The air smelled sharply of iodine and rubbing alcohol. He held a pair of surgical forceps in his right hand, a curved suturing needle clamped in its teeth. He was trying to reach across his chest to stitch the wound, but the angle was impossible, his muscles bunching and trembling with the effort. He stopped, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked up as Maeve hovered in the doorway. He didn't ask. He just held out the forceps. "I can't," Maeve blurted, taking a step back, pressing her spine against the doorframe. "I don't know how to do that. I'll hurt you." "I'm already hurt, typist," Arthur said, his voice flat, exhausted. "And if I don't close this, I'm going to bleed through the bandages and ruin a very expensive mattress. Take the needle." Maeve shook her head, tears of pure frustration and panic welling in her eyes. "I just do data entry. I type numbers into spreadsheets. I don't sew people together. You're going to learn tonight." He dropped the forceps onto a sterile blue towel on his lap. He leaned his head back against the headboard, closing his eyes. "You want to know what happens if I die in this bed, Maeve?" Hearing her name again, spoken with that raw, abrasive exhaustion, made her flinch. "This apartment is leased under a shell corporation," he continued, eyes still shut. "The security protocols are biometric. If my heart stops, the system locks down. You won't be able to open the front door. You won't be able to call the elevator. You'll sit in this vault until you starve, or until my associates come looking for me in 2 weeks. And when they find you with my body, they won't ask for your side of the story." He opened his eyes and leveled a dark, heavy gaze at her. "So, I suggest you figure it out." The sheer, cynical brutality of his logic short-circuited her panic. It was a mathematical equation of survival. Maeve pushed off the doorframe. Her legs felt like lead, but she walked across the dark wood floor and stopped in front of him. She picked up the cold, steel forceps. They felt heavy, alien in her hand. Tell me what to do, she whispered. Swab it with the iodine first, he instructed, his voice low, bracing himself. Then pull the edges together. Pierce the skin a 1/4 inch from the tear. Drive it through. Don't hesitate. If you go slow, it hurts more. Maeve picked up an iodine-soaked cotton pad. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She pressed it against the raw, open meat of his shoulder. Arthur's entire body went rigid. A sharp, violent hiss escaped his gritted teeth, his good hand curling into a fist and burying itself deep into the mattress. But he didn't pull away. "Sorry," she gasped, her own eyes tearing up in sympathetic pain. "Do the needle," he ground out. She lined up the curved tip against his pale skin. Her stomach pitched violently. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, then pushed. The resistance was horrifying. The tough, elastic give of human skin, followed by a wet pop as the metal pushed through the tissue. Arthur let out a low, guttural groan that vibrated in his chest. "Pull it through," he ordered, his breath hot and ragged against her wrist. "Tie it off." 2 knots. She fumbled, her fingers slipping on the thin synthetic thread, but she managed to loop it and pull it tight. The jagged edges of the wound drew together, puckered and angry. "Again," he said. They did it 5 more times. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by his sharp intakes of breath and her quiet, panicked sniffling. She was standing between his knees, leaning over him, close enough to smell the sweat and the metallic tang of his blood, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his chest. It was an awful, clinical intimacy. When the last knot was tied, she dropped the forceps onto the towel and backed away, as if she had been burned. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the sloppy, uneven row of black stitches she had put into a human being. Arthur looked down at his shoulder. He grabbed a roll of white gauze, wrapping it tightly over the stitches and taping it down. "It'll hold," he muttered. The adrenaline was completely gone now. The reality of the quiet, sterile room crushed down on Maeve. "Who were they?" she asked, her voice cracking. Arthur reached over to the nightstand, picking up a heavy crystal tumbler and a bottle of amber liquid. He poured 2 fingers, his hand surprisingly steady, and downed it in 1 swallow. "Men who work for a competitor," he said, pouring another glass. "Callahan. He's been trying to find my central routing hub for months." You handed him the IP address on a silver platter. "I made a typo," she sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. It was an ugly, snotty cry, her chest heaving, her face contorting. She wasn't a hero. She was a tired, broke girl who wanted a working heater. "I just wanted my landlord to fix my door." Arthur stopped with the bottle halfway to the glass. He watched her break down. He didn't look pitying. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, like he was watching a machine malfunction and didn't have the manual. He set the bottle down. He picked up the second glass, filled it, and held it out to her. "Drink," he said. Maeve shook her head, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "I said drink," he repeated, his voice harder, cutting through her panic. She looked up, her face wet and red. She took the glass with trembling fingers and threw it back. The cheap whiskey burned like battery acid all the way down her throat, making her cough violently. But the heat spread in her stomach, forcing her lungs to expand. "Your old life is dead," Arthur said bluntly, leaning back against the headboard, watching her cough. "Callahan's men saw your face. They know where you live. If you go back there, you'll be in a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens by Tuesday." Maeve stared at him, the burn of the whiskey mixing with a fresh, icy spike of terror. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "Nobody ever does," Arthur replied, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "But you're my problem now. And until I figure out how to wipe you off the board cleanly, you're staying exactly where I can see you." Morning didn't break. It bled through the edges of the mechanized blackout shades in a sickly, pale grey. Maeve woke up with her cheek pressed against the rough, expensive weave of a charcoal sofa in the living room. For 3 seconds, her brain offered the merciful illusion that she was at home, that the dull ache in her spine was from her own lumpy mattress, and the lingering smell of copper was just a nosebleed from the dry radiator heat. Then she shifted her weight. Her knee screamed in protest, the skin scraped raw from the rusted fire escape. The memory of the deafening gunshot and the dying man sliding down her refrigerator hit her with the physical force of a baseball bat. She sat up, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs. The penthouse was dead quiet. The air filtration system hummed a low, sterile, white noise. She looked down at her hands. The blood under her fingernails had dried into dark, crusty crescents. She wasn't home. Home was a crime scene. Home was gone. A sharp, distinct click echoed from the kitchen area. Maeve flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. Arthur was standing by a massive marble-topped island. He was wearing a clean pair of dark denim jeans and a tight, black, short-sleeved Henley. The fabric stretched taut over the thick, white bandages, bulking up his left shoulder. He looked pale, the shadows under his eyes bruised and heavy, but his posture was unnervingly straight. He held a small, plastic burner phone in his right hand. The battery cover snapped shut under his thumb. He didn't look at her, but he knew she was awake. "Coffee is in the pot," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Black. There's no sugar here." Maeve swung her bare feet onto the cold walnut floorboards. Her muscles felt like they had been beaten with hammers. She stood up, swaying slightly, and walked toward the kitchen. She didn't want coffee. She wanted to wake up. But the smell of the dark roast, rich, earthy, and expensive, was the most grounded thing in the room. She found a heavy ceramic mug in the cabinet, poured the black liquid, and wrapped both hands around it. The heat seeped into her stiff joints. Arthur tossed the burner phone onto the marble counter. It landed with a sharp clatter. "Callahan is tearing the West Side apart looking for the leak. He thinks you're a rival data broker. He thinks I extracted you." Maeve stared at her reflection in the dark surface of the coffee. "I type invoices for a trucking logistics company." "Not anymore." Arthur leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. "My people scrubbed your apartment 3 hours ago. They took your laptop, your phone, your mail, every piece of paper with your name on it. Then they set a chemical fire in the walls. It'll look like faulty wiring. The building was a death trap anyway. The fire inspector won't look twice." The mug slipped a fraction of an inch in Maeve's grip. The coffee sloshed over the rim, burning her knuckles, but she barely felt it. "You burned my apartment." "I erased the trail," Arthur corrected, entirely devoid of apology. "Callahan's men who breached your door are currently sitting at the bottom of Lake Michigan in the trunk of a stolen Honda. Your neighbors told the cops they heard fireworks. By noon today, Maeve, typist from the second floor, is a tragic casualty of a slumlord's bad wiring. Nobody will come looking for you. I am a person." Maeve slammed the mug down on the marble. The loud crack made her flinch, but the anger was rising, hot and desperate, burning through the shock. "I have a mother in Ohio. I have a life. You can't just delete me." Arthur didn't yell back. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her with those dark, deadened eyes. "Your mother in Ohio receives a monthly check from you, but you haven't spoken to her on the phone since last Christmas." Your bank account has $42 in it. You have no pets, no boyfriend, and your emergency contact at your temp agency is a defunct email address. He listed the pathetic, lonely facts of her existence with the clinical detachment of an accountant reading a ledger. I didn't delete your life, Maeve. You barely had one to begin with. I just closed the tab. The words hit her like physical blows. They were true. Every single one of them was a devastating, humiliating truth. She had spent the last 3 years in Chicago trying to be invisible, trying to keep her head down, pay her bills, and avoid making waves. And she had succeeded so completely that a criminal could wipe her off the map before breakfast, and the world wouldn't even hiccup. Tears prickled the corners of her eyes, hot and shameful. She refused to let them fall. She gripped the edge of the cold marble counter until her knuckles turned white. "So what now?" she whispered, her voice shaking with a potent mix of grief and absolute rage. "Do I just sit in this glass box until you decide to shoot me yourself?" Arthur pushed off the counter. He closed the distance between them with that slow, unhurried grace that was so terrifying for a man his size. He stopped inches away from her. He smelled of antibacterial soap, fresh coffee, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of the blood she had scrubbed off him hours ago. "I don't kill civilians who fix my gunshot wounds," he said softly, the rough timbre of his voice vibrating in the narrow space between them. "I'm a lot of things, sweetheart, but I pay my debts." He reached out, his large, calloused fingers brushing against the soot-stained fabric of her frayed cardigan. The touch was startlingly light, utterly at odds with the violence she knew his hands were capable of. "You stay here. You learn the rules of this side of the glass, and when the heat dies down, I'll buy you a new name, a new social security number, and put enough money in a Cayman account that you'll never have to worry about a broken heater again." Maeve looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no pity in them. There was only a cold, hard pragmatism, and underneath that, a strange, dark current of possession. He had broken her world, and now he was claiming ownership of the pieces. "And until then?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat. "Until then," Arthur said, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "You're mine to keep alive." 48 hours later, the silence of the penthouse had stopped feeling like a sanctuary and started feeling like a pressurized cabin. Maeve stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy blackout shades were drawn back, revealing a sprawling, dizzying view of the city at night. The rain had cleared, leaving the skyline glittering like a carpet of crushed glass. From 30 stories up, the streets looked like glowing veins. It was beautiful, sterile, and entirely disconnected from reality. She was wearing clothes that weren't hers, a heavy, dark green cashmere sweater and thick black leggings. They had arrived via a secure dumbwaiter system that morning, still in their expensive boutique packaging, completely devoid of tags. They fit perfectly. The implication that Arthur, or someone working for him, knew her exact measurements without ever having to ask made her skin crawl. Yet the cashmere was the warmest, softest thing she had ever felt. It was a perfect metaphor for her current existence. Terrifying, but incredibly comfortable. She heard the heavy oak door of the master bedroom open, followed by the soft, heavy thud of boots on the walnut floor. Arthur walked into the living room. He moved better today. The stiffness in his left shoulder was still there, a slight hesitation in his swing, but the sickly pallor had left his face. He was dressed in a dark suit, sans the tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked immaculate. He looked like the kind of man who owned the city she was staring at. He walked over to a heavy crystal decanter on the sideboard and poured 2 fingers of bourbon. He didn't offer her any. He knew she hated it. "Callahan is making noise," Arthur said to the room, not looking at her. He took a sip of the amber liquid. "He hit one of my storage facilities near the docks, burned 3 million in imported merchandise." Maeve turned away from the window. "Are you going to retaliate?" It was insane how quickly the vocabulary of violence had slipped into her casual conversation. 2 days ago, her biggest conflict was drafting a passive-aggressive email. Now she was casually discussing mob retaliation over a cashmere collar. "I already did," Arthur replied smoothly, leaning against the back of the charcoal sofa. "His lieutenant's car exploded in the financial district about 20 minutes ago. It'll be on the news shortly. Gas leak, they'll say." Maeve swallowed hard. The casual brutality of his world was a constant, freezing shock. "You're starting a war." "The war started 6 months ago, typist. You just accidentally walked onto the battlefield." He swirled the bourbon in his glass, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. He finally looked at her. His eyes tracked over the green sweater, a subtle, approving tightening at the corner of his jaw. "You look better. Less like a drowned rat." "Thank you for the clothes," she said stiffly. "Don't thank me for necessities." He set the glass down. "I have to leave." The words hit her with an unexpected jolt of panic. The penthouse was a fortress, but Arthur was the only thing making it secure. Without him, it was just a high-tech cage. "Leave?" Maeve took a step forward. "Where? For how long?" "A sit-down with Callahan's backers." Arthur's face hardened, the smooth, immaculate facade slipping to reveal the ruthless operator beneath. "I need to convince them that their dog has lost his mind and that hitting my infrastructure is bad for their bottom line. It's politics. What if it goes wrong?" Arthur let out a short, dark laugh. "If it goes wrong, I don't come back." He said it so plainly. There was no melodrama, no fear. Just a cold calculation of risk. He walked across the room, stopping directly in front of her. The sheer size of him blocked out the glittering city skyline. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, matte black handgun. He didn't point it at her. He held it by the barrel, offering the grip to her. Maeve stared at it. Her stomach pitched. No, I don't know how to use that. I told you, I type numbers." "You learn," Arthur commanded, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous timbre. He grabbed her right hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around her wrist, and forced the heavy weapon into her palm. It felt unnaturally cold, incredibly heavy. "The safety is off," he instructed, his voice right next to her ear. "There's a round in the chamber. If someone comes through that elevator door and it isn't me, you don't ask questions. You don't warn them. You aim for the center of their chest and you pull the trigger until the slide locks back. Do you understand?" Maeve's hand was shaking so badly the gun vibrated. She looked up into his face. His jaw was clenched, his dark eyes intense, boring into hers. He wasn't just giving her a weapon. He was giving her the reality of her new life. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, the contradiction of him tearing at her. He was a monster who blew up cars, but he was currently ensuring a stranger had a way to protect herself while he walked into a bloodbath. "Why didn't you just leave me in the apartment?" Arthur looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with adrenaline, and something much darker, much more complicated. He reached up, his thumb brushing a stray lock of hair away from her cheek. The gesture was rough, entirely unpracticed. "Because my world is full of professionals, Maeve," he said softly. "Liars, killers, thieves who do exactly what they're supposed to do. And then there's you, A girl who sends a death threat to a syndicate server because she's cold. He dropped his hand, taking a step back. The emotional distance slammed shut between them instantly. "Lock the deadbolt behind me," he said. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak door that led to the private elevator. Maeve stood in the center of the massive room, the heavy gun dragging her arm down. She watched his broad shoulders, the tailored lines of his suit, the lethal, unhurried way he moved. He punched a code into the keypad. The metal doors slid open. "Arthur," she called out. He paused, one foot in the elevator, but he didn't look back. "Fix the lock when you get back," she said, her voice shaking, but the words were clear. "I'm still holding you to it." A low, genuine chuckle vibrated from his chest, a sound so rare it felt like a crack in the foundation of the building. "I'm coming back, typist," he promised to the empty air. The elevator doors slid shut. The heavy, magnetic lock engaged with a loud, final thunk. Maeve stood alone in the silence. She walked over to the door. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. She reached out, her fingers closing around the heavy brass thumb turn. Click. The deadbolt slid into place. The apartment was secure. And for the first time in her life, Maeve realized that the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't on the outside. It was her. And just like that, Maeve is no longer a victim. She's a survivor, locked in a high-rise vault with a loaded gun. Will Arthur survive the sit-down, or is Maeve about to have to use that weapon? If this gritty, tension-fueled Mafia romance has your heart pounding, smash that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a dark, slow-burn thriller. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the explosive next chapter of Maeve and Arthur's story. Sound off in the comments. Could you pull the trigger if the elevator doors opened? Let me know.